So we're on chapter 21, last section, which is section 5 of your U.S. history book. We're going to be discussing Woodrow Wilson and his administration as president. He was the 28th president. We're going to go over some of the domestic affairs and foreign affairs, and a big thing that happened during this time was the Federal Reserve Bank, and then on to the World War I, which will be in the next section, next chapter. So some trivia about Woodrow Wilson. He was 6 feet, 1.5 inches tall. His father was a Presbyterian minister, and Wilson was elected president of Princeton University in 1902. So his nickname was the schoolmaster in politics. And he also won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1920, same as Teddy Roosevelt did. So then some things about Woodrow Wilson. Yes, I do believe that Woodrow Wilson was a Christian. I believe he had some ideas that now we look back that I'm not really fond of, ideas on globalism and the League of Nations. We'll find out about that later on. And of course, now globalism is really going the wrong way. And also some of his beliefs on the Federal Reserve Bank, and also on little socialistic ideas of more government control in certain areas where the government shouldn't control. But anyway, Woodrow Wilson administration. Woodrow Wilson was the 28th president. In 1913, he was the first native Southerner elected after the Civil War. So he was a Southerner. Now, this is unusual during this time. So he was a very moving public speaker. He was a teacher. He was very astute student of American history and government. So he knew a lot about government as he taught it. In 1910, he had never held a public office, but then he was made for a short time governor of New Jersey. And in 1912, he was elected president of the United States. He was a hard-fighting and uncompromising statesman. He was born in Staunton, Virginia. That's that first Southerner there. Virginia's in the South. In 1856, he was the son of a devout minister, Presbyterian minister. So he was born in 1856. Wilson never lost his deep reverence and respect for the Bible. And he also, from his father, held strong beliefs in the value of education. Of course, he being a teacher and a professor, he took a stand against the political bosses as a servant of the people. Those are some things. He was a Democrat. And we saw how basically what happened with the Republicans is the Republican Party was split in half by Teddy Roosevelt running in the Bull Moose Party against his friend Taft, who was president at the time, which split the Republican Party and brought the Democrat Party in, and Woodrow Wilson won presidency. In domestic affairs, we're going to talk about the Underwood-Simmons Act. So Wilson went to Congress to ask for a downward revision in tariffs. Remember, Democrats always now wanted the lower tariff rates, right? And so he was the first president since John Adams to make a personal appearance before Congress for the Underwood-Simmons Act. So he came before Congress. He was a very eloquent speaker too. So as he came before Congress, he basically explained what he thought of the Underwood-Simmons Act. And so since Jefferson's day, Thomas Jefferson never went before Congress, and most presidents did not. But he was the first president to go before Congress himself. And so Congress passed the Underwood-Simmons Act. It was the first major tariff revision since the Civil War. So in the Civil War, the tariffs were made high at that time to basically prevent goods from these other countries, stipulating goods from other countries coming in. And so basically the United States would protect a lot of the businesses and industry in the United States. But the farmers did not want that. So anyway, the goods such as raw materials, agriculture, machinery were put on a free list then. So what they did is they had the tariff, but they also stipulated certain goods that were needed that would have the lower tariffs. You know, certain goods were put on not even lower tariffs; they were free. So certain goods that needed to come into the country. So in 1913, the Underwood-Simmons Act, just think it's a tariff act, you know, is one of the most significant tariff acts in American history. To make up for lost revenue, the act provided for tax on personal income. Okay, here's the big deal. Before this time, the United States got a lot of its revenue for the federal government through tariffs. As these ships would come in from countries, there would be a tariff charge. Each charge, the tariff tax, they'd have to pay, and then it would go to the pool, and the higher the tariffs, the more money our government would make off these merchants, right? So when they lowered the tariffs, especially down to the free list, there was a loss of revenue. So at the loss of revenue, the loss of money coming in, what were they going to do? The government's going to go broke, right? If they don't get any revenue. So they provided a tax on personal incomes in America called income tax. And that's what we have to pay, right? Income tax. The more you made, so far, if you couldn't have, if you couldn't have enough giving out of that, then you would end up paying a personal income tax. And so this is how it got started with income tax with Woodrow Wilson, under Woodrow Wilson, because he had the tariff so low. To provide for extra revenue, he had to provide for tax on people's incomes. So, okay, so here's Wilson's New Freedom. So now we're not going to talk about the square deal anymore. That was under Teddy Roosevelt, and the dollar diplomacy that did not work was under Taft. And now Wilson, he'll have the New Freedom. And New Freedom, he said there were 3 points. Lower tariffs under the Underwood-Simmons Tariff Act, a change in the banking structure and reform, which we're going to find about in the Federal Reserve Act, and this is going to be kind of a crazy deal. But on to the new trust legislation, and he too was the trust buster of the Clayton Act and the Federal Trade Commission, and we're going to go over those things. So here's the Underwood-Simmons Act for tariffs, to reduce tariffs. The 16th Amendment for taxes. Now we have to pay taxes, right? And that came on the 16th Amendment. 16 amendments. So remember, that's income tax. That's why we have to pay our taxes every year, right? Income tax. The 16th Amendment to the Constitution, ratified before Taft left his office, made income tax possible. So the new income tax was graduated, so higher incomes would be taxed higher rates. So at this time, even before Taft left, he had it all together, but Woodrow Wilson actually promoted the 16th Amendment, or put together the income tax. It was called the graduated income tax or progressive income tax, which meant as progressive, graduated means as you made more money, you're going to have to pay more taxes. That's graduated. The precedence was set for the precedent was not set for future rates. So they set the precedents, but they knew that in the future the rates are going to be different, so that would have to be changed in the future. Quickly, this became the federal government's chief source of income. So now the income that the federal government gets now is from our taxes, right? Income tax. The Federal Reserve Bank, okay. In December of 1913, the Congress adopted the Federal Reserve Act, and it was created by a privately controlled central banking system under the control of the federal government. Key is privately controlled. So they have to have private people that are controlling the central banking system under the control of the government, which controls the government to some. So when you look at this, it's really, even being private, what the problem there is, you had some very wealthy private people that got their fingers in to try to control our banking system. So It divided the nations into 12 banking districts with the Federal Reserve Bank in each district. So if you look at the country, you'll see there's 12 different districts of the Federal Reserve Bank. And all the banks were invited to become members, and all of them did. So each regional had a board of directors in each of those 12 banking districts, and the entire system was governed by the Federal Reserve Board in Washington, D.C. It was a 7-member board appointed by the president. So you have a board in Washington, D.C., and now they have a banking system that is privately controlled by certain very wealthy people. You know, one of the beginnings of the Federal Reserve Bank was a very wealthy man named Morgan. So Pierpont, Morgan right there. So J.P. Morgan, you would call him. Anyway, so he was very wealthy, and he had his hand into controlling or working with the government. And so the reason they did that, because they didn't want any depressions or panics where everybody ran to the bank. So they thought, well, this Federal Reserve hopefully will help us from going into a major depression and the banks closing down, because that's what actually happened in the past. So they thought that this would help, but then again, they were giving too much control to certain private individuals. So in fact, I have this here, Jekyll Island here, this picture, because some of these wealthy men at this time, including J.P. Morgan's guys and Rockefeller and everything, they secretly went in 1910 or 12, I think it was 1910, but they got together on Jekyll Island to discuss this, and it was a secret meeting that only certain people invited, only these privately controlled guys that were going to go into this Federal Reserve, put together how the Federal Reserve is going to work. And it was actually, the president wasn't there or anything, so what were they doing? Well, they're deciding how or they were going to finagle, I think, our Federal Reserve. So you can say what you think, and you can look this up, but it's true. They met on Jekyll Island, and they were secret. They had to dress in hunting gear so nobody would know them, and change their names and everything else, because they did not want America to find out what was going on. Now, what was that? That is crazy. That's all I have to say. There must be some fishy things going on Jekyll Island to do with our banking system, huh? But that's all I'm going to say on that subject. You can look up information and decide what you think on that. Federal Reserve notes now. The 12 Federal Reserve banks were not permitted to do business with the public, but to serve as bankers' banks, serving the needs of the member banks. They were empowered by Congress to issue Federal Reserve notes to member banks in exchange for bonds and promissory notes. So member banks would issue Federal Reserve notes to their customers, and by controlling these notes in circulation, the Federal Reserve could expand or even control the economy. Which control for good or control for bad? That is the question. So they could have control. So the Federal Reserve notes, in this way, they thought could control the country from going into panics, bank panics. And basically control going into if you take economics, recessions and depressions, where people lose their jobs and everything else, and they can't get their banks, and that was happened. But the thing about the Federal Reserve, let me tell you, this happened in, we're talking about 1912 and 1913. Well, we went through the Great Depression, when FDR was president during World War II. So why would we have to go through the Great Depression if this so worked? So really, in actuality, did the Federal Reserve banking system, is that the best way? Did it really work? Well, it's evident it didn't during the Great Depression. But anyway, that's kind of my ideas, but this is exactly what happened in history, that now we'd have those 12 Federal Reserve banks that were doing business with, not with the public, but with bankers' banks. And so they could control all of the banks in the United States. The secondary purpose of the Federal Reserve. The secondary purpose was to serve as a banker for the federal government. So the Federal Reserve System was to assist commerce, prevent banking panics, and turned out to be much more than that, because now they actually would be loaning money, through the Federal Reserve, loaning money to the government of the United States. So by changing its reserve requirement, how much percentage of deposits that member banks are required to hold in reserve, the Federal Reserve System can control the amount of money that banks can loan. So now they can control, the interest rate on loans and how much that these banks can loan. That was pretty great control now. They can also influence the expansion of credit through discount rates, the rate of interest charged as member banks that borrow money from the Federal Reserve banks. So the banks were borrowing money from the Federal Reserve banks, and then we have some private guys involved in the Federal Reserve. These guys were possibly making tons of money through the Federal Reserve, and also loaning money with interest. So there's a big thing about the secondary purpose of loaning and setting interest rates. And so this is huge, So basically it's making the power behind the Federal Reserve System more than it's ever been, right? And that's looking on even today, that the Federal Reserve is a very, very powerful part in controlling our banks. It can control people, is what they do sometimes. So it depends. Federal Reserve could have some good purposes. It depends on how strong they get in the point of governmental intervention or intervening in our government, right? So here's the 12 different districts here, if you see, of the Federal Reserve in our country. So which district, if you're in California, this would be your district, whatever district you are in the Federal Reserve. The Federal Trade Commission. In 1914, the Congress created the Federal Trade Commission, bipartisan board member of 5 members on it. So this replaced the Bureau of Corporations that was set up by Theodore Roosevelt in 1903. So this Federal Trade Commission came in it to operate trade going on for corporations in the midst. Federal trade, just think. So Federal Trade Commission was empowered to investigate businesses engaged in interstate commerce and issue cease and desist orders against those deemed unfair trade. So this has to do with the trust busting, right? With the big monopolies and stuff. So the Federal Trade Commission now could investigate a certain business to see how they're doing their interstate commerce between states. And if they're not doing it right, they can say, okay, you got to stop, cease and desist orders until things get worked out, right? So as a way of controlling big business, Federal Trade Commission. The Clayton Antitrust. Think of antitrust. So they're another way to control huge monopoly businesses. So in 1914, Congress adopted the Clayton Antitrust Act and declared certain business practices totally illegal. So they outlawed the various types of interlocking detectorate and holding companies that limited competition. So basically, if a company would limit the competition against them, that would be outlawed. So they couldn't limit the competition against them and go buy out their competition or go burn down their competitors, barns or whatever, So it was illegal for business to temporarily cut prices to put competitors out of business. So what they would do is that they would cut their prices so low that everybody would want to buy things from them. And so they put their other competitors out of business. And then after they put them out of the business, they raise their prices back up. It was illegal for them to do that, to cut their prices just for a little bit until they can get rid of their competitors. It's not a good thing. It was illegal for a manufacturer to force a retailer to sign a contract barring handling of competitors' products. So another thing. So they would basically, it was illegal to force your competitor, to sign a contract that competitor could not do certain things. So that would be illegal. That's another way they would manipulate their competitors and be able to take them out of business. So they exempted labor unions from the antitrust law. So labor unions were not involved in this Clayton antitrust law. So the labor unions and injunctions in labor disputes were not put under the Clayton Antitrust Act. So since the Sherman Act in 1890, there were two new types of business organizations that were popular. What were these two business operations? Interlocking directorate. And what in the world does interlocking directorate mean? Basically, it meant formed when the same man served on the board of directors for several companies. So you'd have several companies that were run by the same guy, the same man that was on a board of directors, or the board of directors would be the same. Say the board of directors would be the same for the railroad and the steel industry. Somehow that is a little bit weird. You have the same man running two companies. They couldn't interlock and direct companies together and say we're the heads of all of these different corporations. They couldn't do that. So a holding company was a corporation whose business held stock in other companies, possibly creating a monopoly. So a holding company would say, okay, we are going to hold stock in another company. How would that be? Starbucks maybe saying they're going to hold stock in another company, most of the stocks, so they control another coffee company or something. So they control, another Starbucks controlling, or Starbucks coffee controlling Pete's Coffee or something like that, which they don't do. But that's just an example is a holding company would either have they either can have the same board of directors, which would become illegal, or they could have a holding company buy out their shares. So these were popular in this time. So under this act and everything, they had to look into these things for the Clayton Antitrust Act, right? So the Clayton Act prevented companies from acquiring stock from another company. So they couldn't go buy up another company's stock. And it also supported the workers' unions. And it legalized unions and strikes and injunctions at this time, the Clayton antitrust. Just think antitrust, it was against these big monopolies, business. Here's a picture of Monopoly board, huh? Foreign affairs. In the Caribbean area, however you want to pronounce it, in the Caribbean area, there was foreign affairs going on during Woodrow Wilson's time, just as there were in Roosevelt's and in Taft's time too. But now we have a revolution in Haiti from 1914 to 1915. So the Haiti Treaty made it temporary protectorate of the United States. Because these areas too, in the midst were involved to Cuba and Puerto Rico and everything, that America was involved in these areas, and there were a lot of Americans that have business in this area. So in Haiti now, the treaty they put with Haiti at this point made it a protectorate of the United States. The United States would come in and protect Haiti. On the island of Haiti, we have Haiti, on this island here, we have Haiti and we have the Dominican Republic on the same island here. So just to know. So the Dominican Republic, so we're talking about Haiti and we're talking about the Dominican Republic. So basically the reason that the United States made Haiti a protectorate was because of the revolution going on, and to help them to pay their debts. Because the more in debt that they got, then they would have problems with even foreign countries at that time. So basically the United States basically put in their hand to protect Haiti, and also in Dominican Republic. They had a revolution too in 1916, and the U.S. continued supervision of the finances also in Dominican Republic to come in and help peace, or to bring peace in the area of both Haiti and the Dominican Republic. The United States sent Marines into both these countries to restore order, and both countries were put on a sound basis financially. Haiti and Dominican Republic. Okay? And keeping the Panama Canal secure, that was always a problem because the countries around there were prone to revolutions all around in Central America. So in 1916, the United States paid Nicaragua $3 million to build a canal through it. So we thought, okay, here we have down here Panama, and we have Nicaragua right here. So it's kind of important. See, Nicaragua's right on next to Costa Rica, which is right next to Panama, and then Colombia. All these countries here, and here's the canal. But right here, there was another route. They thought we should build a canal through here. So anyway, the United States paid Nicaragua $3 million to build a canal through it, and the use of a naval base in Nicaragua's Pacific coast. In 1917, the United States purchased the Danish West Indies that are now called the Virgin Islands for $25 million. And they're located at the entrance of the Caribbean Sea, so it's very important that we have a military base there so that we could defend the Panama Canal. So because the Virgin Islands now, we could say, as different military, European military ships would come in, that we could actually defend them if they came in to promote problems and revolutions. So, and on to the weeks before World War I, because we're going to be going to study about World War I, President Wilson settled a dispute with Great Britain and the United States about opening the Panama Canal. In 1912, the United States passed a law exempting some American ships from paying tolls. And this violated the Hay-Pauncefoot Treaty of 1901. And so, because basically all nations would have to pay equally, right? But the United States passed a law that we would not have to pay the tolls, as much money for the tolls as the rest of the world. Well, this violated the treaty, and so Wilson came to uphold the integrity and requested Congress to repeal the exemption and say, yes, we need to pay just as much money as other countries are coming through the Panama Canal, that we do not need to get a rebate on it or, pay less. So that's what happened. As countries are looking on and say, oh, we have a treaty here about that. The United States need to pay just as much as we are. So, but this actually paved the way for Anglo-Americans during World War I, for that paved the way of our supporting England. Because when England saw that, okay, the United States is not going to take advantage of us, they actually became closer to us. And of course, we'll know in World War I and World War II that we became close allies with Great Britain. So Anglo being England, right? Anglo-American means English American. So just to let you know about that. Trouble in Mexico. So we're torn by a series of revolutions and dictators, and there was much chaos in Mexico. And this stained the United States-Mexican relations, of course. And President Wilson refused to recognize the dictatorship of Victoriano Huerta. So here we are with him right there. And he basically knew he was a dictator, so he refused to recognize him. So the United States intervened when Germany sent munitions into the country there, into Mexico. And so, enforcing the Monroe Doctrine again, Wilson set up the United States Navy to Mexico to prevent arms from being delivered into Mexico. So we're having problems here. We know they're a dictator. If Germany's bringing arms in there, basically Germany is trying to set up, and indeed they were, because that's what happened in World War I, was trying to set up munitions, actually set up so that we would be able to easily be attacked if we decide to join their war in the future. So Germany was coming in and working with the dictator of Mexico against the United States. And this would have been a cause of war with Mexico, but Huerta lost support and had to flee to Europe in 1914. So we could have had a war, but he lost support and was out of there. Mexico struggles in power. I'm not really good at my Spanish, but Venustiano Carranza and then Francisco Pancho Villa. So basically they both lived 1859 to 1920, 1878 to 1923. Carranza was officially in charge of the new government. And so Villa and Carranza, they were former friends. In fact, 17 Americans were murdered in northern Mexico, hoping to provoke the United States to action against him. So Pancho Villa, he basically had murdered Americans, hoping that the Americans would come in, trying to incite, a war condition in Mexico. So Pancho Villa crossed into the United States, killing 17 more Americans. And in response, Wilson sent 7,000 troops under General John J. Blackjack Pershing. He lived 1860 to 1948. So Wilson sending in our troops. And Pancho Villa eluded Pershing. Pershing went in, drawing him deeper into Mexico. Pershing was chasing him all over Mexico. Of course, we don't know the Mexican terrain. So Carranza grew alarmed that American advance was coming into Mexico. So that seemed that war was going to be likely with Mexico again. So finally, President Wilson ordered his General Pershing forces to abandon the whole thing, which, I don't think was the best deal, but it abandoned the pursuit altogether after Americans had been killed and murdered, and withdraw empty-handed from Mexico. So Pancho Villa never was caught. He went out free from that. It prevented a war, but in that way, Americans were very afraid of that time of what was going on in Mexico. Kind of even up to today, a lot of time we look at Mexico like we don't know what's going to happen there. We don't know if the government's going to support us at all. So when I think of President Wilson and his decisions there, I don't think probably they were the best decision. But we let Pancho Villa go. Progressive political changes. So I'm going to stop right there for this last section because we're getting up there in time. And we're going to go over what were the political changes during the time of Woodrow Wilson administration.